The black stallion surged. The ox-blood lasso dropped from the rider's hand and cinched tight around her ankles. She hit the ground hard. The shale came up fast, tearing skin and dress as the horse dragged her across the hardpan. Half a mile of Colorado rock and dust and blood. She was 22, 6 feet and 1 inch tall. The postmistress who had stood behind her counter every day for 4 years because sitting hurt too much to bear. Now the rope burned, and the rocks ground, and the man above laughed like the world belonged to him. The town in the valley did not come. It did not even look. High on the ridge, a man in a bear fur coat watched the dust plume rise. He stood perfectly still. He did not look away. His hand found the rifle. The faint sound of her struggle reached him on the wind. He took 1 step down the slope into the trees. Dust never settled in Greystone. It just moved. From the mine carts to the cattle pens. From the cattle pens to the storefronts. From the storefronts into your lungs, your eyes, the back of your teeth. By August, it was less like weather and more like a condition, something permanent. Something the town had decided to live inside of rather than fight. The silver made it worth it. That's what they said. The silver made everything worth it. The post office sat at the junction of Main and Crail Street, wedged between a saddle maker who smelled of tallow and a dry goods store that never quite had what you needed. It was a narrow building, 2 stories, with a sign that needed repainting and a brass bell above the door that rang with more cheerfulness than the situation usually deserved. Vera Calloway opened that door every morning at 7. She had opened it every morning at 7 for 4 years, even this morning. Day 21. 21 days of standing, not because she wanted to, not because she was dedicated or determined, or any of the words people use when they want to make suffering sound noble. She stood because sitting sent a white bolt of agony through her entire lower body that started at the base of her spine and ended somewhere behind her eyes. So she stood. She sorted the morning mail standing up. She operated the telegraph key standing up. She handed parcels across the counter and said, "Good morning and good afternoon, and here's your letter from your cousin in Denver, and that'll be 12 cents, standing up." 21 days of it. Her hands knew where everything was, without looking. Her feet had memorized every loose floorboard. Her spine had learned to hold itself at an angle that distributed the weight just enough to keep going, just enough to keep from falling, enough to stop hurting. Nothing was enough for that. Mrs. Harriet Calm came in at 8:30. She always came in at 8:30. She was the wife of the man who owned the feed store, and she collected parcels for 3 of her neighbors, who were too elderly to make the walk, which Vera had always privately thought was genuinely kind, which made what happened next sting in a particular way. Harriet looked at her, really looked at her. Vera saw the recognition move across the woman's face, the slight widening of the eyes, the flicker of something, concern, maybe, or something adjacent to it, that came and went like a cloud shadow over open ground. Then Harriet signed for her parcels, tucked them under her arm. "You look tired, dear," she said, and left. That was it. That was the whole of it. "You look tired, dear." And the bell above the door rang its cheerful little ring. And the dust came in for a moment, and settled. And Harriet Calm walked back to her feed store life, and Vera Calloway stood behind her counter and thought, "She knows. She looked right at me, and she knows," and she chose that sentence. "You look tired, dear." 21 days, and that's the sentence. The town of Greystone, Colorado was not a cruel town. That was the thing. That was the part that sat in Vera's chest at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and couldn't sit and stood, leaning against the wall of the back room, counting the knots in the pine planks to give her mind something to do. Greystone was not cruel, it was just convenient. In its convictions, in what it chose to see, in the daily arithmetic of whose pain was worth the trouble and whose wasn't. Chester Harlan had been mayor for 11 years. He owned the bank. He owned 2 of the 3 saloons. He owned the newspaper. He owned, through a careful architecture of loans and debts and favors owed, the patience and the silence of most of the people in between. The doctor, the sheriff, the reverend who had listened to Vera's account of what happened on Miller's Creek with his hands folded and his eyes aimed at something above her left shoulder. Perhaps, the reverend had said, there was some misunderstanding. Vera had not gone back to the church after that. He was not a cruel man in the way that requires cruelty. He was a man who had discovered, early and thoroughly, that fear was cheaper than kindness and considerably more reliable. He had been running that particular economy ever since. She had tried exactly 3 times to be heard. 3. She had counted them carefully the way she counted everything, the way she had kept her father's books, the way she filed the carbon copies of outgoing telegrams in alphabetical order, because some part of her believed that if you kept good enough records, the truth couldn't be buried. Sheriff Brixton. Nothing to investigate. Miss Calloway. Doc Pruitt said it was a riding accident. Doc Pruitt's the medical professional, not you, Mrs. Harmon, the baker's wife, who had been kind to Vera since her father died, who had brought soup twice during the winter, and who Vera had believed, genuinely believed, was a person who would help. Vera, honey, you know long pause. My husband has a loan with Chester's bank. It comes due in November. I'm sorry. I can't. The Reverend, who had said what the Reverend said. 3 after the 3rd, she stopped trying. Not because she gave up exactly. More because she ran a precise internal accounting, and the math became clear. No one in Greystone was going to help her. No one in Greystone could afford to. So she stood, and she sorted the mail, and she thought sometimes, at 3 in the morning, about the telegram. 3 days before Wade Harlan rode up behind her on Miller's Creek Trail. 3 days before the lasso. She had been in the back room, sorting the afternoon delivery, when Chester Harlan walked in to use the telegraph. He did this occasionally. He thought the office was empty. She heard him through the thin partition wall, his voice, and the click of the telegraph key as he dictated to the relay operator, and the words, a silver claim, registered under the name of a man who had died 18 months ago in a mine collapse. Active filing, active revenue, moving through a Denver associate named. She had the name. She remembered the name the way she remembered everything, precisely and permanently, moving through that associate into accounts that didn't officially belong to Chester Harlan but practically did. Federal. Fraud. The kind that brought marshals. She had stood very still on her side of the partition wall. She had not moved. Had not made a sound. But Chester Harlan had glanced through the small glass pane in the partition door on his way out. He had seen her hands. She hadn't known what that glance meant. Not then. She filed the carbon copy of that telegram in the records drawer, under H for Harlan. Because she filed everything in alphabetical order, because that was what you did. 3 days later, she understood what the glance had meant. She didn't remember all of it. The mind does that. Keeps some things, blurs others. Protects itself from the parts it can't process all at once. She remembered the trail. Miller's Creek in the late afternoon, the water low from summer drought, the cottonwoods starting turned at the edges. She walked his path because the air was cooler near the water. Because, after a day hunched over the telegraph key, her shoulders ached and the walk loosened them. She remembered the sound of hooves coming up behind her faster than a walking pace. She remembered looking back, Wade Harlan on his black stallion. The ox-blood lasso already in his hand, already spinning. She had time to think. That's odd. She had time to think. Why does he have? The loop dropped over her ankles, snapped tight. The horse surged forward, and the ground. The hardpan, the shale, the scattered gravel baked by the summer into something close to glass. Came up at her and she was moving through it on her back, on her side, on whatever surface the motion threw her against, a quarter mile of it, and the sound of Wade Harlan laughing somewhere above and behind her. When he cut the rope, she was in the dirt. She couldn't feel her legs immediately. Then she could. She wished she couldn't. She lay there for. She didn't know how long. Long enough for the sky to change color. long enough for the creak noise to feel very far away. Then she began to crawl, 2 miles, in the dark. By the time she reached Greystone, her dress was in ruins, and she had left a trail that the dust swallowed by morning. And Dr. Pruitt examined her wounds, who understood exactly what he was looking at, and Mayor Chester Harlan stood behind him, with a leather satchel that made a particular heavy sound when he set it on the desk. Riding accident, the record said. Patient is advised rest and the enclosed salve. She had been given a small jar of petroleum jelly and told to stop making trouble. 21 days ago, 21 days of standing. The bell rang at 10:30. She didn't look up immediately. She was in the middle of a stack of outgoing letters that needed to be sorted by route before the noon rider. Then she looked up, and then she kept looking up. He was not from Greystone. This was the first and most immediate fact. He moved like no one from Greystone moved, without the particular self-consciousness of people in towns, that awareness of being observed, that slight performance that settles into a person when they spend their life among neighbors. He moved like a man who spent most of his time in places where no one was watching. Economical, direct, no wasted steps. He was 40 years old, maybe, though the mountain had added something to that, a weathering that went beyond years into something more like condition. His beard was thick and dark, beginning to silver at the jaw. His coat was cured bare fur. His boots had seen several 100 miles at minimum. He smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and cold air from above the tree line. He was very large, not loud about it. Not the kind of large that fills a room by announcing itself. The kind of large that simply is, solid, quiet, like old-growth timber. You became aware of the space he occupied, not because he demanded your awareness, but because the space itself changed when he was in it. He approached the counter, set down a bundle of letters and a folded slip with telegraph coordinates. "Need these sent to Cheyenne," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had spent a long time in silence, and had therefore stopped using words for anything except what required them. Vera reached for the papers. She shifted her stance to reach the telegraph key. The spasm hit without warning, 21 days in, and they still hit without warning. The viciousness of infected tissue, pulling against damaged muscle, a white-hot contraction that started in her lower back and radiated outward in 3 directions simultaneously. Her knees buckled. 1 degree, maybe 2. She caught herself on the edge of the brass machinery, both hands, her breath going out in a sharp, involuntary sound she'd been suppressing for 3 weeks. She had gotten very good at recovering quickly. She was already smoothing her expression before the man across the counter had time to react, except he didn't look away. He didn't look away. That was the thing. That was the detail her brain snagged on and couldn't release. Everyone looked away. That was the unspoken agreement Greystone had made with itself. You saw it, you felt the brief, uncomfortable awareness of something wrong in your immediate vicinity, and then you found something else to look at. The window, the floor, the very interesting grain of the counter wood. Because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant involving yourself, and involving yourself meant he did not look away. He stood perfectly still and he looked at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, with the inventory gaze, the cataloging of her height and her frame, and the calculation of whether she was intimidating or available. This was different. This was reading. She had seen this kind of looking exactly once before, when a tracker from the Northern Territory had passed through Greystone following a stolen horse. He had crouched over a patch of disturbed ground near the livery and looked at it with precisely that expression. Total absorption, no performance, just the pure process of extracting information from available evidence. The man at her counter was doing the same thing. His eyes moved, deliberately, her posture, her hands, her face, the way she was holding herself. The slight backward lean that took some weight off her lower body, so subtle she doubted anyone had consciously noticed it in 3 weeks. And then his eyes went to the hem of her dress, Her boots, the angry dark rings visible above the leather. Deep ones. Old enough to have settled into the skin permanently. New enough to still be actively wrong. He went very still. "You're standing on borrowed time." His voice. Quiet. Matter of fact. The way a man states a thing he has observed and assessed and found to be simply factually true. Her hands tightened on the counter edge. "I'm fine," she said. "Just a fall from a horse. Doc Pruitt said it was. I've tracked wolves in steel traps that looked better than you." He leaned his forearms on the counter. Not crowding, not threatening, just closer, his eyes on hers. "I've seen men thrown from Mustangs. A fall breaks your collarbone, bruises your hip. It doesn't leave braided rawhide burns on both ankles." Paused. He pawed one beat. "And it doesn't leave a person standing for weeks, because their back is too shredded to bear weight." The silence after that was very complete. Something shifted in her chest. She had been holding a particular configuration of herself in place for 21 days. Will and necessity built into an architecture. Careful, load-bearing, every piece dependent on every other piece. Mopped, she had not let herself think too clearly about what it contained, because thinking too clearly about it would compromise the structure, and the structure was the only thing keeping her functional. He pressed one finger against it, lightly. At exactly the right angle, she felt the whole thing begin to move. "Please," her voice cracked. "Just once. Just on that word. Please don't. You don't understand how things work here." "I understand a lie when I hear one." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "And I understand sepsis. You've got a fever in you. Another few days of this." He stopped. "Then, who did it?" She opened her mouth. She meant to say, "No one. Nothing. Riding accident," Dr. Pruitt said. She had said these words or their equivalents for 21 days. They came automatically. They were worn smooth with use. What came out instead was, "It hurts when I sit." That was it. That was all. The simplest sentence, the truest one. The one she had been saying in various forms to various people in this town for 3 weeks. And not one of them had stayed in the same room long enough to hear it finish. "It hurts so much," she said. "And everyone just looks right through me." The wall she had built around the thing cracked dramatically. She didn't crumple. She was not the kind of woman who crumpled. She stood exactly where she had been standing, behind the counter of her father's post office on day 21, and the tears came down her face, with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting a long time for permission. He was quiet, just for a moment, just long enough. "Close the shop," he said. His name was Cormac Reeve. He told her this while she hobbled to the front door and flipped the sign to closed and drew the green window shades. He told her the way he told her everything, briefly, without extras. Cormac Reeve, Wind River trapper, down twice a year, Vera Calloway, she said. Here every day. Something passed across his face. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent. He guided her to the back room, where she kept the narrow cot she'd been sleeping on. For 3 weeks, because the walk home to her boarding house had stopped being manageable around day 4. He didn't force her to sit. He looked at the space and found a solution the way practical men will find solutions, by looking at what's available, rather than what's conventional. He positioned a stack of grain sacks to support her upper body, so she could lean forward and take the weight off her legs without putting pressure on the wounds, like a wounded animal finding the particular angle of least pain. "Tell me," he said. He pulled the stool over and sat beside her. Not looming, not crowding, within her sight line. And she told him. She told him about the telegram she had overheard. The silver claim, the dead man's name. Chester Harlan's Denver associate. She told him about the glance through the partition glass and the 3 days between that glance and the lasso. She told him about Miller's Creek. She kept it factual and brief, because going into it fully would require more structural integrity than she currently had. And she was already operating at a deficit. The lasso, the horse, a quarter mile, the crawlback. She told him about Dr. Pruitt and the leather satchel and the petroleum jelly. She told him about the sheriff, the Reverend. Mrs. Harmon and the November loan payment. She told him about 21 days of standing. When she finished, the room was quiet. She turned to look at him. He was sitting exactly as he had been sitting, completely still, forearms on his knees, eyes on the middle distance. But the air around him had changed in a way she felt more than saw. Like the atmospheric pressure before a significant weather event. Something had gathered. Something had made a decision. He stood up. "I'm going to get supplies," he said. 10 minutes. "Don't open the door." "For whom?" she said. "Anyone," he said. He was gone 9 minutes. She counted. He did not go to the general store. She found this out later, that he had gone to a woman named Rosalie Fawn, who lived in a small adobe structure at the edge of Greystone where the town stopped pretending it had order and became honest dirt again. Rosalie was an herbalist. She had been in that spot for 6 years. Chester Harlan had never bothered to consider her worth influencing, because he had never once thought about what she knew or what she could do, which was its own kind of invisibility. Its own kind of power. Cormac came back with clean linen, a bottle of good rye whiskey, dried usnea lichen in a paper wrap, pale green, almost silver, the kind that grows on high mountain spruce, bundled yarrow, a jar of raw pine pitch mixed with dark honey, thick as cold butter. He set them down on the workbench. "This is going to hurt," he said. She almost laughed. "Almost. Everything hurts," she said. "Do it." He worked for 2 hours. There was no other way to say it. He simply worked, with the focused quality of a man who does difficult things alone on a regular basis, and has learned that the only way through them is through them. No hedging, no excessive reassurance, no performance of gentleness that was really about making himself feel better. Just the work. He sterilized with whiskey, and he apologized each time, because the alcohol hitting open tissue was a specific and spectacular variety of agony, and she was bite down on a folded piece of leather he'd given her without being asked, and the apology was sincere and brief, and he moved on. He used a pair of small silver tweezers from his pack, the kind a man carries when he spends time in train, where small injuries become large ones if left unaddressed, sterilized over a candle flame. He used them to do what Dr. Aldous Pruitt had been paid specifically not to do: reroam the debris, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, shale, gravel, the particular small sharp remnants of a quarter-mile of Colorado hardpan, moving through human tissue at speed. Each piece was small and terrible, and its own quiet accusation. He was working on the deep laceration near her right hip when the tweezers caught on something. He paused, extracted it slowly, held it to the light, a piece of braided rawhide, an inch long, maybe slightly more. Dyed a color that was distinct and specific, dark red, almost the color of old blood, the color of something made by a craftsman's hand to be recognized and admired. He cleaned it, looked at it, said nothing for a moment. "Vera, does Wade Harlan carry an oxblood lasso?" Not a question, the way he said it. She turned her head. Her vision was slightly blurred from the fever and the sustained effort of not making more noise than necessary, but she focused on the small object in his fingers. "Custom made," she said. "He had it made in Denver. He mentions it to anyone who will listen." Cormac folded the fragment into a square of clean linen, placed it in the breast pocket of his coat, buttoned the pocket, and then continued working, as if the pocket now contained something with weight and purpose, and he was simply acknowledging that and moving on. Which was, she supposed, exactly what it did. He applied the usnea and yarrow poultice. She felt the drawing sensation immediately. The infection, responding to something that knew how to address it. Sealed the worst of the wounds with the pine pitch and honey, which was warm and dense and smelled of the high forest in a way that was almost unbearably clean, after weeks of the dust and the pain and the smell of her own infection. He bound her with clean linen. "You can lie on your side now," he said. Slowly she shifted. The relief was something she had no adequate language for. The burning that had been the baseline reality of her existence for 21 days. subsided from something impossible to something survivable, and the difference between those two things was so vast and so immediate that her entire body exhaled at once. She was crying again. She noticed this with a kind of distant observation. Third time today, probably more. She had lost count. Why, she said. Not dramatically, just the question. The honest one. He was quiet for a moment. He had set the stool beside the cot, where she could see him without turning her head. Out in the wild, he said, when something is wounded, the pack either protects it or ends its misery. They don't pretend it isn't bleeding. He looked at her steadily. This town is worse than animals, Vera. And they're going to learn what happens when they wrong someone that a man like me decides to care about. She should have been frightened by that. She was not frightened at all. She was aware distantly that she had stopped being afraid of him. Not because he had said anything to reassure her. Not because he had asked for her trust, or done anything to perform his worthiness of it. Simply because he had been in this room with her for 2 hours, and the room had stayed safe. She filed this under the category of things worth knowing about a person. They came at her door 40 minutes later, hard knuckles. Oak door. The rhythm of a man who has been told to knock like he owns the place. Vera Calloway, Deputy Carl Brixton. She knew his voice the way she knew everyone's voice. She had been handling his mail for 4 years. We know the mountain man is in there. Mayor wants a word. Open this door. She looked at Cormac. He was already standing, checking his Colt revolver with the calm efficiency of a man who has done this before. Enough times that the fear has been replaced by something more useful. He looked at her. Rest, he said. He walked to the front room. The deadbolt clicked, the door opened. Brixton was on the boardwalk with 2 hired men who wore guns, the way decorative men wear expensive watches, for impression rather than expertise. He had his hand on his peacemaker. He had the expression of a man who had come to conduct a performance of authority. He looked up into Cormac Reeves' face. The performance wavered. Mayor Harlan wants a word, Brixton said. You're trespassing on. The only trespass happening here, Cormac said, is a town full of cowards, burying a woman alive to protect a rich man's son. Brixton reached for his gun. Cormac's hand closed over Brixton's wrist. One motion. The crack was audible from the back room, where Vera lay on the cot, and she heard it, and understood what it was, and felt something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. The second hired man folded sideways into the horse trough. There was a significant splash. The third man's hands went up before Cormac had fully completed his turn. Cormac reached into his breast pocket, produced the linen square, unfolded it, held the fragment of oxblood rawhide an inch from Brixton's face. Brixton, who was sitting in the dust clutching his wrist, gone the pale of a man whose assumptions about the next 5 minutes have been comprehensively revised. You tell Wade Harlan I found his property, Cormac said. Low, even. The voice of a man who has no interest in theater, only outcomes. And you tell Chester Harlan that Marshal Warren Lusk in Denver doesn't owe him a single dollar. He dropped the deputy, walked across the street, kicked open Dr. Pruitt's door. The doctor was packing a carpet bag. He had been watching from his window. Please, Pruitt said, backing against the far wall. He was 55 years old, and frightened in the specific way of a man who has made compromises for so long that he has stopped being able to locate the version of himself who wouldn't. I had no choice. Chester. He threatened, my practice, everything I. Sit down, Cormac said. Pruitt sat. Cormac placed a sheet of blank medical stationery on the desk. Set a fountain pen beside it. You are going to write a sworn medical affidavit, he said. Exactly what you saw. The lacerations, the rope burns, the shale fragments you deliberately in the sepsis you chose to ignore. And you are going to state, clearly, that her injuries are entirely consistent with being dragged behind a horse, and inconsistent with a fall from one. Pruitt's hands were shaking. And then you're going to sign it. The pen scratched. The clock on the wall marked the seconds. Outside, through the window, Greystone went about its afternoon. the way it had been going about its afternoons, with the determined ordinariness of a place that has decided the best response to its own conscience is to keep moving and not look directly at anything. Pruitt signed. Cormac took the paper, blew on the ink, folded it with the piece of oxblood rawhide into the breast pocket of his coat, 2 pieces. He was already calculating the third. He had ridden 3 seasons of post-war contract work out of Denver before the mountains took him for good. He knew enough names in that city to know which ones still meant something. Marshal Warren Lusk was one of those names. He walked back to the post office. Vera was sitting up on the edge of the cot. She had her color back. Not fully, not in a single hour. But the fever flush had differentiated from something dangerous into something merely bad. The glassy quality in her eyes had sharpened slightly. She looked at him with the careful assessment of a woman who has been evaluating people's intentions for 21 days and has become very good at it. "We have to leave," he said. "I know. Harlan will panic when he hears Lusk's name. They won't try to buy my silence. Not someone like me. They'll try to bury us both. I know that too," she said. He stopped. Looked at her. "The records drawer," she said. "The carbon copy of that telegraph. Harlan's message to Denver. It's filed under H, where I file everything." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he went to the drawer, found the carbon, read it. Added it to the breast pocket. 3 pieces now. The rawhide, the affidavit, the telegraph carbon. Together they made something that would not be easy to dismantle. He stepped up to the brass telegraph machine. His Morse code was precise, fast. The code of a man who had used it under conditions where speed was the difference between the message arriving and the messenger not. He tapped the message to Denver, addressed to Marshal Warren Lusk. Direct and detailed, the corruption, the assault, the fraudulent silver claim, the physical evidence secured, names, dates, the specific geography of what had happened in Greystone, Colorado, and who had permitted it to happen. He did not know about Finn Dole. Nobody knew about Finn Dole yet. He carried her to the supply wagon hitched behind the building. She had started to argue about this. Had gotten approximately 3 words into a sentence about being capable of walking before the look on his face. Not impatient, not dismissive, just entirely practical. Stopped her. "We need to move before dark," he said. "The wagon is faster." "That's logical," she said. "Yes," he said. He carried her the way a man carries something he has decided to take care of. Without drama, without making more of the moment than necessary. Just doing the thing that needed to be done in the most efficient way available. The wagon bed was lined with bear pelts. Thick. Warm in a way she had forgotten warmth could feel. She lay on her side. The horses moved. And Greystone, the post office sign that needed repainting, the saddle maker, the dry goods store, the church where the Reverend had told her perhaps she'd been misunderstood, the bank that owned everyone, the mayor's office with the polished floors and the brass fittings, and the man behind the desk who had built his entire prosperous life on the certainty that some people's pain could always be made convenient. Greystone got smaller. And then smaller. And then it was just a shape in the dust below the mountains, indistinct, growing indistinct with distance, the way things do when you are finally moving away from them. She did not watch it disappear. She turned her face toward the peaks. The Rockies in the late September light were doing something extraordinary, turning purple at the upper elevations, then rose, then a deep amber at the tree line, like something enormous and old, and entirely indifferent to human events, was simply existing in its own great colors at the end of another day. She had never been this far up, she thought. "It's very beautiful," she thought. "I can't believe I'm noticing that." And then she fell asleep, on the bear pelts, in the wagon, moving upward through the dust and the fading light, while the man who had stopped when no one else had stopped drove the horses higher and higher into the dark, clean air, above everything that had tried to bury her. The first day she counted trees, not deliberately, not as a strategy, just. Her mind needed something to hold on to that wasn't pain, and trees were there, and they were countable, and counting them was something her hands didn't have to do. 63 ponderosa pines before the trail curved. 17 aspens in a cluster near the water crossing. One enormous Douglas fir that had fallen across the path so long ago that the wood had gone silver and soft, and something was living in the hollow of it. She couldn't see what. She could hear it. The wagon jolted over a root. She made a sound she hadn't meant to make. Cormac stopped the horses, not immediately, a few seconds, long enough to find a wider section of trail, a place where he could set the brake without the wagon tilting. Then he climbed back and checked the dressings without asking. Repositioned the pelts beneath her hip. Said nothing about the sound she'd made. Got back up front, started the horses again. That was the whole of it. Which was, she didn't have the right word for it. Kind felt too small. Professional felt too cold. It was something in between. Something that said, I see you. I see that it hurts. And I'm not going to make you explain it, or perform your pain in a way that makes me comfortable. She counted 31 more trees before she fell asleep again. The trail changed around them as they climbed. She drifted in and out. Fever sleep, the kind that isn't fully sleep, more like the mind stepping sideways into a room adjacent to consciousness and leaving the door ajar. Sounds came through clearly. The creek somewhere below the trail, insistent and cold. The horses breathing in the thin air. The creak of the wagon on a particularly steep pitch, and underneath all of it, the sound of Cormac Reeve, which was almost no sound at all. The slight shift of weight on the wagon seat. The occasional low word to the horses. A man who had spent so much time in silence that silence had become his natural element, and sound was the thing he moved through deliberately, carefully when he needed to. She woke fully when the aspens began. The leaves were turning, not the cautious turning of the lower elevations, a yellow at the margins, tentative, testing, but the full committed gold of altitude, where the seasons don't negotiate. They simply arrive. The light coming through them was the color of something warm. She lay on her side and looked up at them through the canvas flap. She had been inside Greystone for 4 years. Inside. The post office, and the boarding house, and the path between them. And occasionally the church, and the general store, and Dr. Pruitt's clinic. She had not seen aspens turning since her father was alive. She had forgotten there were aspens. She let herself stay with that for a while. Not with grief, exactly. Grief required a form of attention she was too tired for. But with the simple fact of it. Her father had been alive. Then he had not been. She had buried herself in his post office and the work of it, and the carbon copies, and the filing, and the Morse code. And 4 years had gone past while she wasn't watching. And somewhere in those 4 years the aspens had turned 11 times without her noticing. She noticed now. The gold of them, moving in the thin mountain air. She noticed now, and it was enough. Day 2, the blue spruce started. Dense, dark green. They smelled different from the lower trees, sharper, colder, something almost medicinal in the resin. Vera breathed it in deliberately, the way you breathe in something that helps, and felt the tightness in her chest loosen by a fraction that had nothing to do with the physical wounds. Cormac changed her dressings at midday in a clearing where a stream crossed the trail. He'd found a flat rock she could lean on. He worked quickly, assessed the wounds with the same expression he assessed everything. Focused, impersonal, reading information from what he saw. Better, he said. How much better? The infection is moving backward. He applied fresh yarrow. You'll keep the skin. She processed this. You weren't sure before. No. You should have told me. You were already in pain, he said. Uncertain outcomes don't help pain. She thought about arguing this. She was, genuinely, the kind of woman who believed in knowing the full truth of her situation. But also, 21 days of standing. Maybe he had a point. Fine, she said. But from here on, agreed. Day 3, they left the wagon. The trail had been narrowing for hours, becoming more suggestion than path. threading between boulders in a way that required judgment rather than following. The horses could manage it, but the wagon couldn't. Cormac unhitched the team at a natural shelter, an overhang of granite large enough to keep them from the weather, tied them with grain and water in reach. "Can you walk?" he said. "Not, are you okay? Not. How are you feeling specific?" Answerable. Vera tested her legs, stood upright against the wagon side. The pain was manageable, which was a word she had not been able to apply to her physical situation for 3 weeks, and hearing it in her own mind had a particular quality. "Yes," she said. 40 minutes, he said. "Not flat. I'll pace for you." She didn't tell him she didn't need him to pace for her, because she did, a little. She just didn't want to say it. They went up. The cabin appeared without announcement. She had been watching the trail directly in front of her feet. The granite was uneven, demanded attention. And then she looked up, because the quality of the light had changed. Opened out, and there it was, small, serious. Hand-hewn pine logs fitted with a precision that spoke of someone who had taken their time, who had understood they were building something meant to last in conditions that did not forgive shortcuts. A stone chimney, a heavy door with iron strapping. Windows positioned not for the view but for the sight lines. She understood this immediately, the way someone who grew up in an office that handled sensitive information understands the placement of functional elements. You could see every approach from inside, every one. A man who built that kind of window placement had thought carefully about who might be coming, and from what direction, and why. The view from the ridge itself was, she stopped walking. Just stopped. Couldn't help it, 100 miles in every direction, the whole of the territory spread out below like something God had laid out to dry. The mountains in the far north, still carrying last winter's snow in their high-shaded creases. The valley floor, patchwork green and brown, the silver thread of a river she didn't know the name of. Greystone, she found it after a moment, a cluster of shapes. Smoke from chimneys rising thin and vertical in the still air. Small, so small from here. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. All of that happened in that tiny thing down there. It had felt so enormous, and from up here it was just a smudge. "Come inside," Cormac said from behind her, gentle, like a man who has seen this moment before. Who knows what it does to a person? She came inside. The room was exactly what it needed to be. Nothing more. A fireplace taking up most of the north wall. A table of rough planks, 2 chairs, both built with the hands of someone who knew more about function than aesthetics. Pelts on the floor. Shelves running the length of the east wall, every jar and bundle and tool in a defined place with space around it. A sleeping area behind a hanging wool blanket in the far corner. Everything in the room had earned its place. Nothing else had been allowed in. And yet not cold. She couldn't explain that. The room should have been cold, bare of anything soft or ornamental or chosen for comfort. But it wasn't. It had the quality of a space that had been lived in carefully, by someone who paid attention to it, and attention is its own kind of warmth. On the far wall, between the rifle rack and the window, there was a photograph, small, framed in plain wood, 8 men in uniform, standing in 2 rows before a tree line she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a moment without saying anything. The men in the photograph were young, all of them. The kind of young that only becomes visible in retrospect when you know what came after. She looked at Cormac's face, then back at the men in it. "Shait." She said nothing. 8. But she filed it. Under the category of things a room tells you about a person without being asked. "Sit," Cormac said. He meant at the table, in one of the chairs, where she wouldn't have to hold herself up. She sat, and, the first time in 21 days, full weight, no white bolt, no bracing against the anticipated agony. Just the ordinary human fact of sitting in a chair, her body against the wood, her spine releasing something it had been holding for 3 weeks, with both hands. She didn't make a sound. She just sat there. And the tears came down her face in a very quiet and complete way. And Cormac lit the fire and did not comment. Which was, she thought, Perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She slept through the night for the first time on day 4, real sleep. Not fever sideways, not counting knots in pine planks. She woke at dawn to the smell of something cooking, a venison broth, simple and dense, already steaming in a tin cup on the edge of the hearth, and lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light and did a quiet inventory back. Hurting, but differently. The difference between a wound fighting itself and a wound beginning, cautiously, to accept repair, fever, lower. She could feel it. Clarity returning behind the eyes, the fuzziness resolving back into edges, hands, steadier than they'd been in days. She sat up, slowly, carefully, and then fully. Breathed day 4. I made it to day 4. The pattern of days settled into itself. Mornings, Cormac changed her dressings, brief, efficient. He gave her the honest assessment every time, because she'd asked him to, and he kept his word, in the flat, uncomplicated way of a man who doesn't track promises, he just makes them. When he means them and keeps them. Because that's what making them means. Afternoons, she sat at the table. He brought her paper, and she began to write. Not letters, not her journal, the telegram. She was reconstructing it from memory. Every word Chester Harlan had dictated through that partition wall. The claim number, the associate's name, the figures, the specific legal language of the fraudulent registration. She had a memory that had been shaped by 4 years of handling other people's correspondence, 4 years of carbon copies and careful records, 4 years of filing things, precisely because precision was a form of respect for the information. She remembered every word. She wrote it out twice, 3 times. Slightly different emphasis each version, testing her own memory for consistency. Everything matched when Cormac came in from the afternoon's work and saw what she was doing. He stood at the door for a moment, picked up the papers, read them, set them down, said nothing for a moment, then, second copy, third, actually, she said. He looked at her. I'm a postmistress, she said. I make copies. Something happened to his face again, that thing adjacent to a smile. She was getting better at identifying it. He put the pages beside the originals, in the breast pocket, which was at this point carrying more weight than most briefcases she'd ever handled. Evenings were different. Evenings had a quality the days didn't. Something that came with the fire settling into coals, and the temperature outside dropping, and the high-altitude dark that was not like valley dark. No ambient glow from town, no sound from below, just the mountain making its own quiet. They talked, not much, not in the way of people performing conversation. In the way of two people who have found themselves in the same space and whose silences have become comfortable enough that the words that break them tend to be the honest ones. She learned that he'd been a scout, not through confession, through accretion, a detail here, a reference there. He mentioned General Crook without context. She filed it, didn't push. He mentioned reading terrain in the way that suggested specific training, specific experience, something beyond the ordinary, woodsman skill. On the 5th evening she asked directly, Scout, he said, during the war, long range, 3 years, which side, Union, and after. He was quiet for a moment. After, he said, I tried. She waited 2 years of trying, he said. A farm, a town, a life that looked like the life men are supposed to want. He stopped. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned that some silences are not fulfilling. I led a unit into a position, he said finally. We'd been tracking a movement for 3 days. I read the terrain wrong. One feature, one ridge. The wrong side, I called it wrong. He looked at his hands. 7 men's. Silence. You survived, she said. Yes, so you came up here. So I came up here. She thought about this. Cormac. Reading terrain wrong. Once in 3 years of reading terrain in the dark in contested territory under enemy fire. She paused. Let that sit. That's not a character flaw. That's a probability. He said nothing. I'm not saying it doesn't hurt, she said. I'm saying there's a difference between guilt and responsibility. And you've been up here long enough, treating them like the same thing. The fire settled. The dark outside the windows was very complete. "You're a postmistress," he said eventually. "I handle a great deal of correspondence," she said. "You learn things about people." She looked at the photograph on the wall. 8 men. She looked back at him. He followed her gaze. Stayed with it for a long moment. Said nothing. But the shape of his shoulders changed. Something released that had been held for a long time. Just slightly. Just enough for her to see it had happened. He poured more coffee. They sat until the fire burned down. The morning of day 6 passed quietly. Vera was at the table, reconstructing the final entries in her third copy of the telegram. Cormac was outside, resetting a series of snares along the northern approach. It felt not safe exactly, because she was not a woman who confused comfort with safety. But purposeful. The days had direction. The evidence was accumulating. They had sent word to Lusk. The machine was in motion. What they didn't know was that the machine had been stopped before it left the station, in Greystone. On the evening of the day, Vera and Cormac had left. Findole sat at the telegraph relay station and looked at a message in the outgoing queue, addressed to Marshal Warren Lusk. Denver. He had been looking at it since the afternoon. He had been hoping it would stop being what it was. It had not stopped. Findole was 26 years old. He had a mother in Ohio who wrote him every month. He had been in Greystone for 14 months. He had been receiving a supplemental payment from Chester Harlan's account for 11 of those 14 months. And this had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable arrangement between practical people. He read the message. Read it again. His hand hovered over the key. He was not a bad person. That is a specific and important thing to say. He was a frightened person who had made a calculation 14 months ago and had been making the same calculation in smaller increments ever since, each one easier than the last, because the first one had already done the heavy work of establishing who he was going to be. He put Cormac's message aside. He wrote a different one, addressed to Denver, which said, in the flat, factual language of official telegraph correspondence, that a previous message sent from the Greystone station should be disregarded as it had been transmitted under duress by an agitated citizen and contained no actionable information. He sent the second message. He sat with the first one in his hands for a long moment. Then he destroyed it. In the cabin on the ridge, Vera looked up from her papers and said to Cormac, "How long before the marshal's office would respond to a message like that?" Cormac considered. 3 days to Denver, day to organize, 3 days back. He paused. A week. Maybe 8 days, so, she calculated. By day 14 we should know someone is coming. Yes, he said. She nodded. Went back to her papers. Day 14. They were on day 6. 8 more days of thinking they had sent a flare into the dark and someone was coming with a lantern. 8 more days of not knowing the flare had been intercepted, that the dark was complete, that no one was coming. Day 7 brought something she hadn't expected. She woke before dawn. Not unusual, her sleep was still interrupted, still surface level, in a way that 4 years of accumulated exhaustion would take more than a week to fully address. She lay in the dark and listened. Cormac was not in the cabin. She had come to recognize his presence as a quality of the indoor air, a warmth, a weight, the sense of something very solid occupying nearby space. When he was gone, the cabin had a different quality, lighter, more exposed. She got up. Carefully, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. He was on the porch, sitting on the top step, looking out at the dark below the ridge, the valley invisible in the moonless night, only suggested by the absence of stars at the horizon line. He was very still. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment before he heard her. His posture told her something, not his face. She couldn't see his face, his back, his shoulders. The way a man holds himself at 3 in the morning, when he thinks no one is watching, is different from the way he holds himself in daylight. More honest, more tired. "I wake up like this sometimes," he said, without turning. He'd heard her. She sat down on the step, beside him, not close. The width of a breath between them. "What do you do with it?" "I sit here, he said. Until the sky changes. She looked at the darkness below. How long has it been? She said. Since you slept through. A while? Years? A beat. Yes, he said. She nodded, pulled the blanket tighter. They sat there until the sky did exactly what he had said it would. Changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The dark gray distinction of the ridge first, then the trees below. Then gradually, the valley floor emerging from the night with the slow patience of a world that has been doing this every morning regardless of what is happening in it. They did not talk. They did not need to. But something in the sitting together, in the two of them, occupying the same step on the same porch in the same pre-dawn quiet, was different from sitting alone. Vera understood this the way she understood the difference between a letter and no letter. The words might be ordinary. The fact of them wasn't. She thought about the photograph on the wall. 8 men, 7 dead. One man sitting beside her on a porch, above the tree line, watching the dark give back the mountains. She thought about the difference between guilt and responsibility. About the 15 years he'd been carrying the wrong word for the right grief. She didn't say any of this. She was a postmistress. She understood that some correspondence was best delivered in silence. The light changed. The valley came back. They went inside for coffee. Day 8. She was at the table. He was outside, chopping wood in the clean, cold air of the afternoon. She was not reconstructing the telegram. She had finished that. She was doing something else. She was looking at the supply shelves, at the system of organization that had struck her as precise when she first arrived, and that she had been observing over 8 days, with the attention of someone whose professional identity was built on how information and materials are organized. It was precise, but it wasn't efficient. The medical supplies were stored with the food stores, which made a certain visual sense. They were all jars, similar in size and material, but made no practical sense. Because when you needed medicine urgently, you did not want to read labels in sequence. Through your salt and your coffee and your preserved plums, the tools were organized by size, not by use. So the tools you used daily were scattered through the sequence rather than grouped at the accessible front. The fire materials were stored on the far side of the room from the fireplace. This was not a crisis. Clearly, a functional person had been surviving up here for 15 years by this system and would presumably continue to do so. But she had been sitting at this table for 8 days with periodic walks to the porch and limited range of motion, and her hands were going slightly mad with nothing precise to do, and the supplies were right there, and she got up. It took her 2 hours. She moved carefully, nothing above shoulder height, nothing that required twisting. She reorganized medical supplies together, most frequently needed at the front, tools grouped by function, daily use items at the accessible end, fire materials near the fireplace, food stores organized by protein, grain, and preserved goods in separate sections. When Cormac came in with the wood, she was back at the table. He set the wood down, looked at the shelves, stood very still. She waited. She was genuinely slightly prepared to be told to put it back. He walked the length of the shelves. He looked at each section the way he walked terrain, attending to it, reading what was there rather than confirming what he expected. The medical things, he said, together. Front access, the tools, by use, daily items in front, the fire, near the fire. He turned around. She met his gaze. I'm a postmistress, she said. Organization is. It's better, he said. She blinked. It's significantly better, he said. I've known for 6 years the fire materials were on the wrong side of the room. Then why? I'd already carried everything over there, he said. Moving it back felt like admitting something. She stared at him. Admitting what exactly? That I'd done it wrong. So for 6 years, carried the wood across the room, he said. Every day the silence stretched. Then Vera Calloway made a sound she hadn't made in she couldn't remember how long. Not a polite laugh, not a careful smile. A genuine sound, unguarded and complete, from somewhere in the center of her chest. It surprised her. The force of it. the way it moved through her whole body. It surprised him too. She could see it, the stillness of someone hearing something they didn't expect and aren't sure what to do with. 6 years, she said again. When she had composure, in my defense, he said, and then seemed to realize he did not. Actually, have a defense. You have no defense, she confirmed. No, he agreed. The wood was across the room for 6 years. I am aware. She was smiling. Really smiling. She had forgotten she could do that without it costing something. He sat down in the other chair. He was quiet for a moment. I would have reorganized it eventually, he said. Another 6 years? Maybe 5. He said. I was trending in the right direction. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the thing that had been building between them, carefully without announcement, in the spaces between one necessary thing and another, in the pre-dawn steps and the reconstructed telegrams, and the reorganized shelves and the photograph on the wall. That thing was simply present. Not new, not sudden, just acknowledged. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce. The fire earned its keep. Then the ravens moved. Day 11, morning. Cormac standing on the porch with his coffee, looking at the tree line a mile below the ridge. Vera inside at the table, looking up, because something in the quality of his stillness had changed. He was not still the way he was usually still. He was still the way a man is still when he is receiving information and processing it with complete focus. She got up, came to the door. He didn't turn around. Cormac. Ravens, he said, below the second ridge. Too many. Too sudden. She looked. She couldn't see what he was seeing, but she had spent 11 days watching this man read the mountain the way she read correspondence, and she trusted what he was reading. How many people? She said. 9, maybe 10. Moving in a group, he came inside, set down the coffee. Give me 2 hours. He was already going to the rifle rack. What do I do? She said. He stopped, turned. This was the thing about Cormac Reeve that she had been watching for 11 days without having the right word for it. He did not say, stay inside, bar the door, wait for me. He looked at her, really looked. The way he had looked at her from the first moment, reading what was there rather than what was expected. And he told her the tactical situation. There are 2 approach routes to this ridge, he said. I can cover the western approach through the timber. The eastern approach comes through the granite shelf. He paused. I can't cover both, she understood. Tell me where to stand, she said. But before he could answer, there was something else to address. Something that had already happened 8 days ago in Greystone that neither of them knew yet. Twist 5 arrived. While they were preparing, not to them. Not yet. It arrived in Greystone, in Dr. Aldous Pruitt's clinic. On the 8th day of Vera's absence, a man came in. He didn't have an appointment. He sat in the waiting chair with the ease of a person who is not actually waiting for anything, because the situation is already resolved. He mentioned Chester Harlan's name, spoken not as a threat but as a point of mutual orientation. We both know this person. We both understand what that means. He mentioned Pruitt's son, an attorney in Denver, building a practice, young, ambitious, promising, fragile, the man implied, in the way that such men imply things, pleasant-voiced, looking at the wall, not at Pruitt, which is how you know the pleasantness is itself the threat the man left. Pruitt sat at his desk for a long time. He looked at his locked drawer. He looked at his hands. His son had written him just last week, a cheerful letter about a new client, a case that was going well, the excitement of a young man at the beginning of something. Pruitt opened his desk. He wrote a letter. He hated himself. As he wrote it, specifically and in real time, with the full awareness of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and is doing it anyway, because the fear has become larger than the self-respect. He described the cabin, the eastern approach, the granite shelf, exactly as Cormac had mentioned it to him during the affidavit signing. He sealed the letter. He gave it to the messenger. He went back into his clinic and sat in his examination chair and looked at the ceiling. He thought about Vera Calloway. He thought about the night she had come in bleeding. He thought about the money on his desk. He thought about his son's letter. He picked up his pen, and he began to write a second letter. Not to Chester Harlan, to someone else entirely. On the ridge, Cormac showed Vera her position. The eastern granite shelf was a natural formation, a series of flat slabs angled slightly toward the approach trail, with a lip of stone that provided cover and a clear sight line down the path. Anyone coming up from the east would have to pass through a narrowing before they reached the shelf. There was no way around it. He had been up since before dawn. She hadn't known why. At the time, she had seen him moving in the dark from the window, had watched the lantern going out and coming back in, had thought, he heard something and he is doing something about it. She understood now. He had been setting deadfalls, weighted traps along the western approach. The work of a man who reads his terrain the way a general reads a map, who had known, at some level, that the ravens would come before they did. He had been preparing. You stand here, he said, indicating the center of the shelf visible. Don't move. She looked at the position. You want me to be seen. I want them to see something they didn't plan for, he said. He looked at her steadily. You're 6 feet and 1 inch. You know every foot of that. I need you to let them know it. She held this. She had spent 22 years managing the space her body took up, making herself smaller, walking sideways through door frames to avoid the commentary, choosing the chair at the back of the room, learning to fold herself into whatever dimension was least inconvenient for the people around her. He was asking her to do the opposite. Stand in the middle, he said. Don't move. Don't speak. Just be there. Just be there, she repeated. It will be enough, he said. I promise you. He gave her the backup rifle, showed her the mechanism, made sure she was clear on it. I don't want to shoot anyone, she said. I know, he said. You probably won't have to, but if you do, ground in front of them. Noise and distance, she nodded. He turned to go. Cormac. He stopped. She didn't say anything else for a moment. She looked at him, this man who had stopped, when no one else had stopped, who had sat beside her cot and listened to 21 days of a story the entire town of Greystone had chosen not to hear, who had carried her up a mountain and reorganized his shelves and sat on his porch steps in the pre-dawn dark and told her about 7 men he'd been carrying for 15 years. Comes back, she said. It was a simple sentence. He recognized its weight. Yes, he said, and went into the trees. Chester Harlan had given his son $10,000 in silver. Wade Harlan had spent 3 days not sleeping and 4 days drinking, and arrived at the decision that he could let someone else handle this. The certainty was irrational. He understood this somewhere below the irrational part. But the irrational part was larger, had been larger for some time. He needed to see it end. So he rode with the posse of 9 pink Orton washouts and deserters and men who had followed the money into one bad situation and another. And Wade rode at the front of them on his black stallion and thought, I will see it end today. He had a new lasso, also oxblood red, custom made in Denver. Certain things are a habit. The first man in the rear of the column vanished. There was no shot, no warning. Just the sound of something large moving very quickly, and then he was gone, 20 feet into the air, suspended in the spruce canopy in a counterweighted rope snare that had been waiting for exactly his weight on exactly that trigger point. He was swinging gently when the second man noticed he was gone. By then it was too late. The 2 men scouting the left flank stepped onto what looked like solid ground covered in pine needles. The ground gave way. A 6-foot pit, sides slicked with wet clay, steep enough to prevent climbing. They went in together, which was probably the most efficient outcome for everyone involved. Panic spread through the remaining 6 the way panic always spreads. Instantly, completely. From one man to the next, like fire across dry grass, they started firing. Into the trees, into the shadows, into the sound of a single pine cone dropping 50 yards to the left, into the memory of where the last sound was, by which time the source of the sound had moved entirely. They wasted a tremendous amount of ammunition on old-growth timber. Cormac moved through the canopy. He did not move fast. Fast was wrong up here, in this terrain, in this timber. Fast made noise. Fast made mistakes. He moved at the pace of the forest itself, the pace of something that belonged here and therefore knew how it breathed. He released the deadfall from the high point, a massive dead log, balanced on a pivot held by a line. It came down the slope in one long roaring slide and took out the pack mule, and all the supplies and the water, and most of the remaining men's confidence. From 200 yards, through timber he fired once. The lead mercenary's rifle cylinder shattered, stared at his gun, then looked up at the trees, then made the decision that only honest men and practical cowards can make. The decision that recognizes when a situation has moved past the point of profitable risk. "I ain't dying on this mountain," he said, loud enough for the men behind him to hear. "For silver I already spent." He turned. He walked back down the trail. 3 men followed without discussion. A 4th hesitated, then followed. That left Wade Harlan, and 2 men who had not yet made their calculation. Wade looked at them. They looked at each other. Then they looked past Wade, and they saw her. Vera Calloway was standing on the granite shelf, fully upright, not pressed against the stone for cover, not crouched behind the lip, standing. In the open, in the full cold morning light of a high Colorado September, 6 feet and 1 inch, she was not holding the rifle like a threat. She was holding it the way you hold something you know how to use, and are prepared to use, and are hoping you won't have to. There is a difference. People who know guns can read it. She was not moving. She was not speaking. She was simply there, all of her, every inch she had spent 22 years managing and folding and apologizing for. Present, unreduced, standing on the granite in the cold mountain light, with the full weight of herself exactly where she had placed it. One of the remaining men said something quietly to the other. The other nodded. Both turned and walked away. Wade Harlan stood alone on the trail. His expensive riding clothes were snagged and torn. His face was red from altitude. His hands were shaking, not from cold, though it was cold. From the physiology of a man whose certainties are failing one by one. He looked at the trees. He looked at the shelf. He made a different decision from his men. He started climbing. She heard him before she saw him. The loose shale on the approach talking under his boots. The rhythm of someone who was angry and breathing hard and not thinking clearly about the noise they were making. He came around the last bend, stopped. They were 12 feet apart. She had time in those first few seconds to look at him the way she had not been able to look at him on Miller's Creek Trail, to see all of it. He was 28 years old. That was younger than she remembered, or not younger, just more visible in his youth now, stripped of the context that had made him seem larger, without his stallion, without his posse, without the borrowed authority of his father's name cushioning every corner of reality. He was just a young man who had done a terrible thing and had spent 21 days watching the consequences of it grow beyond his ability to contain them. He raised his revolver. His hand was not steady. She did not raise the rifle. She looked at him. "You did this because I said no," she said. No preamble, no warm-up. Just the sentence, stated with the flat accuracy of a woman who has had 21 days to reduce it to its essential truth. His jaw tightened. "And because your father needed me quiet," she said. "Because I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. And so you," she stopped, started again. "And so you tied a rope to my ankles and dragged me a quarter of a mile over shale. Because it was available to you, because you could, you should have been more." "No," she said, "just that, just." No, she said again. "I said no to you, and that was the appropriate response. And the fact that it cost me what it cost me is the thing we are standing here to count for." He was breathing hard. "You're nobody," he said. The old contempt, but thinner now. Like fabric that's been washed too many times and has gone translucent at the wear points. "You rode all the way up this mountain," she said, "to silence me." Again she held his gaze. Which means you're afraid. Something crossed his face, the expression of a man confronted with an accurate thing he cannot argue with and cannot accept. He cocked the hammer. The rope came from above, oxblood rawhide, dropping in a perfect loop, snapping tight around Wade Harlan's shoulders, with the casual expertise of a man who has been roping things for decades and finds the mechanism entirely unremarkable. Wade was jerked backward, off his feet, down 10 yards of rocky ground. Enough for him to understand physically, in his body, with his specific skin and his specific nerve endings, what 10 yards of ground feels like at speed. Cormac hauled him upright, turned him, pressed him against the trunk of the largest pine on the ridge. Wade was not struggling. The fight had left him somewhere in those 10 yards. He stood against the tree with the deflated quality of air, leaving something that had been held too tight for too long. Cormac bound the ropes. He did not speak to Wade. He looked at him for a moment, with the eyes of a man who has seen cruelty in its most elaborate and its most casual forms, and has long since stopped being surprised by either. Just clear-eyed assessment. This person, this action, this consequence. Then he turned. Vera was standing 6 feet away, still on the trail. Having come down from the shelf, she was not shaking. She had done what she'd come to do, and the not shaking was something she noted quietly and filed. She looked at Wade, bound to his tree. She had expected something dramatic. What arrived was quieter, the weight of 5 weeks settling into its true shape. Not triumph, not rage, just the long particular cost of all of it, made legible at last by the fact of being over. She looked at Cormac. "Is it over?" she said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The expression that crossed his face in that moment was one she hadn't seen from him before. Not uncertainty, more like recalculation. The expression of a man running numbers that are not adding up. "The marshal," she said. "The marshal should have sent someone by now," he said carefully. She heard the careful. She was a postmistress. She knew what careful meant when applied to a statement about a message that had been sent. "The telegraph," she said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. "Finn Dole," she said, because she had known. For 3 days she had known, in the back of the drawer where she put things she couldn't address yet, that Finn Dole had been receiving money from Chester Harlan for longer than anyone knew. She had handled the bank correspondence. She had filed the payment records. She had not put it together until day 8, lying awake in the cabin, and when she put it together she had sat with it quietly, because there was nothing to do about it from up here. "Our message didn't arrive," she said. "Not a question." "No," Cormac said. They stood on the trail with Wade Harlan, bound to his pine tree behind them, and the whole territory spread below, in the cold September light. No one was coming. No marshal, no deputies. No federal authority bearing warrants and the weight of law. They were on a ridge above everything, with 3 pieces of evidence, a bound man, and no way to reach the world below except by going down into it themselves. She thought, of course. She thought, when has it ever been that simple? And then she thought, all right, there's a federal circuit judge, she said. Cormac looked at her. He holds court in 3 towns. His circuit brings him through Millhaven, the last week of September. She paused. Millhaven is 20 miles east. You know his name. I handled his correspondence for 4 years, she said. I know everyone's name. He looked at her for a long moment. The mountain looked at both of them. We go down, he said. We go down, she agreed. Tomorrow. At first light, she nodded. She looked at Wade Harlan one more time. He would not meet her eyes. She turned away, and somewhere below them, in a small clinic in Greystone, at a desk by lamplight, with the locked drawer open, in front of him, and 4 years of patient records spread across every available surface, Dr. Aldous Pruitt was writing a letter, not to Chester Harlan, to a federal circuit judge, by a route that Chester Harlan did not control, carrying everything he had been paid to forget. They came down in the dark, not because it was safer, not because Cormac had decided the dark offered tactical advantage, though it did. They came down in the dark because Vera had said quietly, standing at the cabin door, with her coat buttoned and her bag over her shoulder, that she did not want to watch Greystone come into view in daylight. She did not explain this. He did not ask her to. He just hitched the horses and they went down the mountain. At night was a different thing entirely. Not frightening. Not to her. Not anymore. The dark up here had a texture she had come to know over 11 days. The cold, clean air moving through timber. The way sounds traveled differently at altitude. The stars so dense and close, they looked like something you could reach up and disturb. She sat in the wagon bed on the bare pelts. She watched the stars. She could not go back there. She knew this the way she knew which letters were bad news before she opened them. By weight. By the specific gravity of a thing that has already been decided. Her father had built that office. He had painted the sign himself in the summer of 1873, standing on a ladder with the focused expression she remembered him wearing when he was doing something that mattered. She had sorted her first letter at his elbow. She had learned to tap Morse code on his knee before she could properly reach the key. The office was not a building. It was the last place he had been fully alive. And she would never open that door again, which was all right. It was going to have to be all right. This was going to have to be the alternative was staying in Greystone, and she had understood. Somewhere between day 8 and day 11 on the mountain, that Greystone was finished for her in the way that certain chapters are finished. Not dramatically. Just. Over. The page turned. The next one blank and waiting. It was a grief, separate from the others, its own shape entirely. Cormac, she said. The Millhaven post office. What about it? You said the man running it wants to retire. 3 years, he said. Fenwick. Can't find anyone willing. Why not? Small, quiet. Not much traffic. He paused. No silver mine. She thought about this. I like small, she said. I like quiet. The wagon moved through the dark. Below them, somewhere in the valley, Greystone was a cluster of dim lights. Almost nothing from up here. Almost invisible, 14 miles from Millhaven, she said. He said nothing for a moment. To here, he said. Yes, she looked at the back of his head, the dark outline of him against the stars. The steadiness of him, that quality she had been watching for 11 days. The way he occupied space and time, with a consistency that had nothing performed about it. Reasons change, she said. He was quiet. You said that, she said. Day 6. When I asked why you come down from the mountain, I remember what I said. I'm just repeating it. I know you are. The horses moved through the dark. The stars wheeled overhead in their enormous, slow turning. Neither of them said anything else, which was, in its way, saying everything. They reached the Millhaven Road at dawn. The light came up gray and clean over the eastern ridge, painting the top of the peaks first, that alpine gold that starts at the summit and moves down slowly, like something being revealed rather than illuminated. Vera watched it from the wagon bed until the valley floor caught too, and the road ahead went from shadow to substance. The Honorable Federal Circuit Judge, Warren Aldous, was 63 years old. He had a single aide and a case of law books and a horse that had been doing this circuit for 7 years, and therefore knew the road better than he did. He was a compact man, with a white beard and the quality of physics that comes from spending decades in courtrooms. The stillness of someone who has learned that patience is not passive, that waiting, done correctly, is its own form of pressure. He did not expect to find a supply wagon stopped sideways across the Millhaven Road at 7 in the morning. He stopped his horse, looked at Cormac, looked at Vera longer, because she was looking at him with the focused, organized attention of someone who has prepared for this moment and is ready to conduct it efficiently. Judge Aldous, she said. He blinked. My name is Vera Calloway. I was the postmistress of Greystone for 4 years. I have handled your correspondence on 5 occasions. I have material evidence of a violent crime and federal fraud that requires your immediate attention. A pause. I would appreciate it, she said, if you would get down from your horse. He got down from his horse. They were with him for 2 hours. In a clearing off the road where his aide built a small fire, because the morning was cold and the documents needed to be read carefully, and carefully takes time. Vera presented everything in sequence. She had organized it. Of course she had. Over the past 2 days, in the wagon and on foot, she had arranged the pieces into the order that would make them most legible to a legal mind. Not her order, not the emotional order, the chronological order of what it had felt like, but the evidentiary order. What established what? What built on what? What made the conclusion unavoidable? The telegraph carbon first. Chester Harlan's message to his Denver associate, the claim number, the dead man's name, the figures moving through. Unofficial accounts, federal fraud, the judge's jurisdiction, the foundation, then the affidavit. Dr. Pruitt's account of Vera's injuries. What he had seen and what he had recorded, and the explicit, signed difference between those two things. Then the oxblood rawhide, extracted from a specific wound, by a specific person, now sitting on the surface of a folded piece of linen, in front of a federal judge, on a road outside Millhaven, Colorado, in the clear morning light. The judge read slowly. He read the way judges read, which is different from the way other people read. With the part of his mind that is always asking, what does this establish, and what does it fail to establish? And where are the joints in the argument? He read the carbon 3 times. He read the affidavit twice. He held the rawhide up to the light for a long moment. Then he looked at Vera. "You were the one who was injured," he said. "Yes. And you've been 5 weeks," she said, "since the attack." As of this morning, he set the documents down. "Miss Calloway," he said, "do you know what the applicable penalty is for the assault you've described? Under territorial law. Aggravated assault, causing grievous bodily harm," she said. 15 to 25 years in the territorial penitentiary, provided the physical evidence is sufficient and the affidavit is considered credible. He regarded her. "You've thought about this." "I've had a great deal of time to think," she said. "I was standing." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The judicial version of a smile, restrained but genuine. "The federal fraud charges," he said. "Those are mine." "Yes," she said. "That's why I'm talking to you specifically." He looked at Cormac. "And you. You're the one who secured this evidence." "Yes," Cormac said. "You broke a deputy's wrist." He reached for his gun first. "That's not." The judge stopped, considered. "We'll address that separately." "All right," Cormac said. Then the judge's aide came across the clearing with a package. He had collected it from the Millhaven post office that morning. Routine. Part of his circuit, he checked the Millhaven post on his way through. He handed it to the judge without ceremony. The judge looked at the address. Looked at it again. Opened it. He read for a long time. Vera watched his face. She had learned over 4 years of handling correspondence to read the quality of a person's reading. The way the pace changes when something significant arrives. The way the body shifts without the person knowing it's shifting. The judge's body changed about 3 pages in. He looked up. "Dr. Aldous Pruitt," he said. "Greystone's physician," Vera said. "He writes here." The judge stopped. Looked back at the papers. "He writes that he contacted the Harlan family regarding your location, on the mountain." Vera went still. "He told them where we were," she said. "Yes." She looked at Cormac. "He was very still," he says. The judge continued, carefully, that he did so under duress, regarding his son, and that he subsequently, another pause, compiled and submitted the enclosed documentation as what he describes as the only remaining thing he could do that was worth doing. He lifted the package. It was thick, much thicker than the affidavit alone would account for. "What's the rest of it?" she said. 4 years of patient records, the judge said. Annotated. Every injury he treated in Greystone, that he documented as one thing and knew to be another. Organized by date. Cross-referenced by. He turned a page by what he calls the source of the implicit pressure to falsify. He set the package on the flat rock that was serving as their table. "Miss Calloway," he said, "this is not just an assault case," she already knew. No, she said. It's not. This is considerably larger than one man's attack on one woman. He looked at her steadily. This is going to take some time to put in proper motion, he said. A week, perhaps. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Cormac spoke before she did. Yes. He said the judge signed a temporary protective order before they left. He wrote it himself, on official paper from his aide's satchel. His handwriting was precise and unhurried. The handwriting of a man who understands that documents are not paperwork. Documents are the shape that justice takes when it has to exist in the physical world. He handed it to Vera. She read it. Federal protection. Both of them. Any interference a federal offense, she folded it. Placed it in the breast pocket of her coat. Judge Aldous, she said. He looked up. The workers in the valley. The men at the silver operations on the fraudulent claims. She paused. When the business unravels, and it will, they shouldn't lose everything because of what Harlan did. Someone should know they exist. He looked at her. For a moment, someone will know, he said. He wrote something in his notebook. She watched him write it. And then they went back up the mountain. The climb felt different. Same trail. Same granite. Same smell of cold spruce and high air. But the weight that had been riding with them. The specific suspended weight of not knowing if message had reached anyone. Not knowing if the world below had any idea what was happening up here. That weight was lighter, not gone. Chester Harlan was still in his mayor's office. Wade was still on his pine tree. Finn Dole was still at his telegraph key, probably still telling himself that the payment was worth it. That none of this would reach him. But someone knew, someone with authority and paper, and the weight of federal law behind them, knew exactly what was in Greystone, Colorado, and who had put it there. That was new. That was enough to breathe. They collected Wade on the way back up. He was exactly where they had left him. The ropes had not moved. Something in Wade had, though. He was cold. Coated in pine sap, in the thorough way of someone who had spent a night pressed against a sap-covered tree with nothing to do but think. His expensive riding clothes were beyond salvage. His face was the face of a man who had been alone, in the dark, with the specific company of his own actions for approximately 14 hours. He did not speak when they found him. He looked at Vera. She looked at him. She had expected something dramatic. What she felt was quieter. The full weight of 5 weeks settling into its true shape, like a figure stepping out of shadow into ordinary light. She looked at Wade Harlan. The federal deputies will be here within the week, she said. He said nothing. She turned away. That was the last time she ever looked at Wade Harlan. Directly, back at the cabin, the fire, the table, the reorganized shelves that Cormac had stopped pretending weren't better. The 2 chairs. She sat in hers. He sat in his coffee. The silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are letting the throughness of it settle. Dr. Pruitt told them where we were, she said. Yes. He sent the package too. Yes. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. How do you hold both of those things at once? She said. It wasn't a rhetorical question. She genuinely wanted to know. Cormac was quiet for a moment. You don't hold them at once, he said. You hold one, then the other. And you keep them separate. The betrayal and the rest of it, he said. Yes, she thought about Pruitt writing 2 letters in the same night. The first one sending them into danger. The second one, spending whatever was left of his professional life to pull them out of it. Neither letter erased the other. Both were real. He knew what the second letter would cost him, she said. Yes, Cormac said. He sent it anyway. Yes, she sat with that. There was something in it that mattered. Not absolution. She wasn't sure absolution was hers to give, or even whether the word was the right one. Something more specific. Something that said, people can do the wrong thing and the right thing. And both of those are real. And sometimes the right thing comes after the wrong one, and that doesn't make it less right. Which was, she thought, a more complicated truth than she usually allowed herself before 9 in the morning. The federal deputies arrived on a Thursday. 7 of them, led by a man named Cole Hanrahan. Marshal Lusk's deputy, a lean, focused man in his 40s who rode like someone who had spent significant time in cavalry and had never quite let it go. He had Pruitt's package and the judge's order, and the energized efficiency of a man who has been given a clear mandate and finds clarity energizing. He arrived at the ridge and was met by Cormac, who handed him a written account of everything. The confrontation with Brixton, the evidence secured, the location of Wade Harlan. Last confirmed bound to a specific pine tree on the eastern approach, alive and cold, and in possession of a great deal of time to think. Hanrahan read it. Then he looked at Vera, Miss Calloway. He said, formal in the way of official proceedings, I have warrants. She waited. Clarence Wade Harlan. Aggravated assault. He looked at the warrant. Chester Augustus Harlan. Federal fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. He turned a page. Sheriff Carl Brixton. Accessory after the fact. Another page. Telegraph operator Finn Full. Obstruction of federal communications. He paused, and Dr. Aldous Pruitt, he said. Falsification of medical records. Failure to report a violent crime. His cooperation, she said, will be considered during sentencing. Hanrahan said carefully, I can't promise outcomes. I can promise it will be considered. She nodded. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The workers at the silver operations on the fraudulent claims. When those assets are seized, she held his gaze. There are families, people who have been earning wages from those claims in good faith for years. Judge Aldous noted it. I want to make sure you've noted it too. Hanrahan looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something. Noted, he said. They went down. Hanrahan and his 6 deputies went down the mountain and into Greystone, and what happened there took most of a day, and very little of it was loud. Quiet justice doesn't announce itself. Quiet justice arrives with his paper and warrants and the accumulated weight of documented truth. It doesn't need to announce itself because the documents speak for themselves. Chester Harlan was in his mayor's office. In the middle of a meeting, 3 men. Discussing the silver operations, the quarterly accounts, the mathematics of how much could still be moved before. The door opened. Hanrahan came in. Chester looked at the warrant. Then he looked at the men across the desk. They were already standing, already calculating the new direction of safety. Because that is what people do when the mathematics change. They recalculate. They calculate where safety is, and they move toward it. Chester Harlan had spent 11 years being the direction people moved toward. In the space of approximately 45 seconds, he understood that this was no longer true. He went with the deputies without a word. That was the most frightening thing. The clerk in the outer office said later. Not the arrest, not the deputies, the silence. Chester Harlan, who had run Greystone for 11 years through the relentless application of his own voice, his certainty, his authority, the sheer confident volume of his particular version of reality, had nothing to say. Sheriff Brixton was at the saloon. Hanrahan found him at a corner table with the posture of a man drinking since early morning and not doing it for pleasure. His broken wrist was in a splint. He looked up when the deputy came in. He went without being asked, which surprised Hanrahan, though it shouldn't have. There is a certain relief, when the thing you have been dreading finally arrives, in not having to dread it anymore. Finn Dole was at his station. Still there, because he had not known what else to do. He had intercepted the telegram. He had sent the false one. He had been waiting. For what? He couldn't quite articulate. For it to resolve itself, maybe. It had not resolved itself. It had arrived at his door in the form of 2 federal deputies with a warrant. He told them everything, immediately. Every message he had intercepted in 14 months on behalf of Chester Harlan. The complete list. He pulled the records himself because he had kept records, not out of conscience, but out of the professional habit of a man who works with information and understands that information needs to be kept. And he handed them over with the quality of a person removing a weight they have been carrying alone. Dr. Aldous Pruitt came to the door before they knocked. He had been watching for them. He had known they were coming. He'd had known since the morning he sealed the second envelope and handed it to the private messenger. Had known that the moment that package reached Judge Aldous, the question of his professional future was resolved, and the only remaining question was the specifics. He was wearing his good coat. He had his hands folded. "I'll come willingly," he said. "I have additional documentation you may find useful." He handed Hanrahan a second package, which contained, among other things, a detailed accounting of every financial transaction he had been aware of between the Harlan family and Greystone's institutions over the preceding 4 years. The complete architecture of obligation and silencing that Chester Harlan had constructed, loan by loan, debt by debt, over 11 years. Pruitt had kept records. Doctors keep records, even when they wished they didn't know what they knew. By the time professional, habit, and conscience had become indistinguishable from each other, Pruitt had long since stopped trying to tell the difference. Wade Harlan was collected from his pine tree at midday. 2 deputies made the climb. They found him sitting against the base of the tree, not struggling, not attempting anything. Just sitting there in the cold and the pine sap, and the accumulated weight of 14 hours of his own company, looking at the valley below with the expression of a man who has finally arrived in honest accounting himself, found the numbers very much not in his favor. He held out his wrists. They untied the rope. He stood up. He was coated in tree sap from shoulder to hip. His hair was stuck to the bark. The separation involved some careful maneuvering, and a considerable amount of dignity forfeited. He said nothing. Not on the way down. Not when he saw his father across the holding yard, also in custody, and their eyes met for one long moment. There was nothing to say. Everything that could be said had already been said, by Pruitt's records, by the oxblood rawhide, by the carbon copy telegram filed under H in a records drawer, by a woman who believed that precision was a form of respect for the truth. The outcomes took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of hearings in Millhaven before Judge Aldous, in a small federal courtroom that smelled of pine resin and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult truths are regularly aired. Vera testified. She sat in the witness chair. She sat, Fulsala, without pain, though there was still an ache in cold weather that she understood would probably always be there, a permanent memory that the body keeps whether you want it to or not. And she told it, from the beginning, the telegram through the partition wall, the glance through the glass, the lasso on Miller's Creek, the crawl. The 21 days, she told it in the flat, organized way she had told it on the Millhaven Road, and in the telegraph office and on the mountain. The way she told everything, precisely, in sequence, with the careful attention to what she had witnessed versus what she had inferred. Wade Harlan's attorney tried twice to introduce the possibility of a different interpretation. Both times, Judge Aldous asked Dr. Pruitt to address the medical record. Pruitt testified for 3 hours. He did not minimize anything. He described the wounds with clinical precision. He described the shale fragments and what their presence indicated about how they got there. He described the fever and what it indicated about how long the infection had been developing untreated. And then he described the night she had come in. His voice was steady. Not comfortable, steady in the way that a man is steady when he has decided that the only thing left worth doing is to be completely honest, and he is doing it regardless of what it costs him. Steady the way a decision looks when it has been fully made. I saw her injuries, he said. I understood immediately what they indicated, and I chose to record something different. Because there was money on my desk and I was afraid. He paused. That is the complete account. I have nothing to add to it. The courtroom was very quiet. Chester Harlan, guilty on 4 counts of federal fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The sentences ran consecutively. He would be in a federal prison for longer than he had run Greystone. The Harlan assets were seized. The fraudulent silver claims re-registered under legitimate ownership. A portion a specific documented portion, per Judge Aldis's explicit instruction, directed toward a compensation fund for the workers employed through those claims. Someone had made sure the judge knew they existed. Wade Harlan, guilty of aggravated assault, 22 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. He would be 50 years old if he served the full sentence. Sheriff Brixton, guilty as accessory, 5 years. Finn Dole, guilty of obstructing federal communications, 2 years, suspended in full exchange for his cooperation, which had produced enough additional evidence to add 3 more names to the charge sheet. He moved to Ohio shortly after. His mother had been writing him to come home for 14 months. Dr. Altuas Pruitt, guilty of falsification of medical records and failure to report a violent crime. His medical license was revoked by order of the territorial governor. His prison sentence, 18 months, was suspended in full in recognition of the cooperation that had been, in Hanrahan's words in his report, decisive in the dismantling of the Harlan operation. He would never practice medicine again. He accepted this. Not easily, not without cost, but with the quality of a man who has looked at what his choices produced and decided that the accounting, however painful, is accurate. He wrote one more letter, addressed to Vera Calloway, care of the Millhaven Post Office. It said, "Miss Calloway, I have no right to ask for forgiveness, and I am not asking for it. I am writing only to tell you that I am sorry I was not a better man on the night you needed one, not because I am sorry for the consequences to myself, because you deserved better and you didn't get it, and that is a fact I will carry. I hope you are well. I hope you sit without pain. A. Pruitt." She read it twice. She thought about it for a long time. Then she filed it. In the careful way she filed everything worth keeping. Under P. Greystone changed not overnight. Towns don't change overnight any more than people do. The change was real, but it accumulated slowly, the way water changes stone, not by force but by persistence, by showing up every day in the same place and wearing something away. Harriet Calm, who had told Vera, "You look tired, dear," and collected her parcels and left, organized a petition. She did not announce this as an act of conscience. She announced it as a practical necessity. The petition called for formal accountability standards for local medical practices in the Colorado Territory. It was addressed to the governor's office. 41 women signed it, which surprised Harriet, and then didn't. Because she was old enough to know that many people have seen things they should have acted on, and sometimes all they need is one clear action to take. The petition did not fix what had been broken, but it was a town turning to look at itself. And that was a different thing from what it had been doing for 11 years. The bank changed hands. Chester Harlan's assets were seized under federal order, and the operation transferred to a trust administrator from Denver, who had the unfortunate habit of actually reading the loan agreements before calling them due. Several people in Greystone discovered, with some surprise, that they owed considerably less than they had been told. Several others discovered that the implied threats attached to those debts had no legal basis whatsoever. The architecture of obligation that Chester Harlan had spent 11 years constructing turned out to be, like most architecture, built on fear, dependent on the people inside believing in its walls. Once they stopped believing, the walls were just wood. The church got a new minister. The reverend who had told Vera that perhaps her presence conveyed the wrong signals had quietly departed for another parish before the federal deputies arrived. The new minister was a woman named Ruth Cassidy, who had spent 12 years doing circuit ministry in the Northern Territories, and had a reputation for the kind of plain-spoken honesty that makes people uncomfortable in the best possible way. She lasted a long time. The new sheriff was a man named Amos Treadwell, appointed by the territorial governor, specifically because he had no existing ties to Greystone, and therefore no existing debts. He was a quiet man, methodical, fair in the way that comes from having been, at some point in your life, on the wrong side of an unfair system. Greystone became Over time, a different kind of place. Not because it had suddenly become populated by better people. The people were the same people. They had just been shown, concretely and expensively, what the cost of looking away actually was. Some of them had watched from the boardwalks, the morning Hanrahan's deputies walked Chester Harlan to the holding wagon. Some had watched from behind their window glass. The way you watch things you are not sure you should be seen watching. Some had simply kept working, at their counters and their hearths and their daily lives, and listened to the sounds of the town rearranging itself around an absence that had, for 11 years, been called a presence. The town clerk, a man named Josiah Fry, who had spent 11 years signing documents he didn't fully read because Chester Harlan stood in the room when he signed them, spent 3 weeks after the arrest reviewing every ordinance, every property record, every zoning permit that had crossed his desk. He found 7 instances of outright forgery and 12 of quiet manipulation that stopped just short of it. He documented all 19. He submitted the documentation to the territorial governor's office without being asked. He did not do this out of heroism. He did it because someone had finally shown him what the alternative looked like, and he had found he preferred his own reflection to Chester Harlan's. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's all it takes. The first snow came to the Wind River Peaks in October, not a storm. It arrived the way snow arrives at elevation, gradually, as a thickening of the air, until one morning the world outside the window was white and quiet, and the sound of the mountain had changed entirely. Softer hoar, enclosed. Inside the cabin, the fire burned. Vera sat at the table. She pulled the chair out, stood in front of it for a moment, then sat down, all the way down, full weight. No bracing, no breath held against the anticipated bolt of white pain, nothing, just the wood of the chair. The weight of her body. The ordinary, unremarkable human fact of sitting in a room. She had not known until this moment how much of herself she had been holding in suspension. How much of her daily consciousness had been allocated to the management of pain. The constant low-level calculation of how to move, how to stand, how to exist in a body that had been turned against her. It was over. Not the other things. Not the hearings. Those were in Millhaven now, in motion, following their own logic. Not the long, complicated business of what came next. But this specific thing, this was over. She sat for a long time. The fire burned. The snow fell. Outside, the mountain held its silence, with the patience of something that has been doing it for 10,000 years and expects to do it 10,000 more. Not indifferent exactly. She had stopped using that word for it. More like, scaled differently. At a scale where individual human events, however enormous they feel from inside, are simply part of the long continuing work of things existing. In that scale, what had happened to her was real, was serious, was worth every document, every sworn word, every mile of mountain trail in the dark. And she was here, still here, sitting in a chair without pain for the first time in 6 weeks. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. She heard the door. Cormac came in with wood, stacked it by the hearth, knocked the snow from his coat, stood at the threshold for a moment, and something in the quality of the room reached him before he moved. He saw her, sitting, just sitting. He set the remaining wood down quietly, sat in the other chair with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to sit in a specific chair, in a specific room, and is at peace with that decision. He poured coffee. She watched him. The Millhaven Post, she said. Fenwick showed file system. Last week he glanced at week. It was bad, he said. I didn't say bad. You didn't have to, he said. You have a specific expression for inadequate organizational systems. She stared at him. I have a specific expression. Yes, you identified it. It's a distinctive expression. How long have you? Day 3, he said. Of the supply shelf situation. She set down her cup. You watched me look at your shelves for 3 days, before I reorganized them. I was curious what you'd decide, he said. And if I'd decided to leave them, I would have reorganized them myself, he said. Eventually, Another 6 years? Maybe 5, he said. I was trending in the right direction. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the thing that had been building between them for weeks, carefully, without announcement, in the spaces between one necessary thing and another, in the pre-dawn steps, and the reconstructed telegrams, and the reorganized shelves, and the way he had said reasons change on a dark road in the middle of the night. That thing was simply present now, not new, not sudden. Just visible. 14 miles, she said. Is not far, he said. Some days it will be far, she said. In winter, some days he agreed. You'd come anyway, question. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. She nodded. Once. The nod of a woman who has decided to believe something and is stating her decision. She picked up her kopje. He picked up his outside. The snow fell in its patient, enormous way. The mountain held them both. Not indifferent to their history, but larger than it. Larger than what they had come from. Larger than what they had lost or what they were, tentatively, beginning to build. At that scale, their smallness felt not diminished, protected, which was, she thought, precisely the right quality in a place to call home. She was writing to her cousin Frances. Dear Frances, I am writing from a high place. Actually high, above the tree line in the Rocky Mountains. The cabin of a man who found me when I needed finding and has not found me to be too much since. I know you will have a great many questions. I will answer them in time. I want to tell you this. I sat this morning, and it didn't hurt. I know you will understand why I needed to write that sentence. The town is different now. I am told this. I will not go back to see for myself, because some places belong to who you were, rather than who you are becoming. That is not a tragedy. That is geography. There is a post office in Millhaven, 14 miles from here. The man running it has been trying to retire for 3 years. I spoke to him last week. He showed me the filing system. Frances, the filing system. I start in November. She sealed the envelope. She mailed it on a Tuesday. She was at the Millhaven post office, her 3rd week. She had rearranged the filing system in the 1st, updated the telegraph equipment in the 2nd. The residents of Millhaven were still developing their understanding of the new postmistress. Her height, her efficiency, the handshake that surprised people the first time, the way she spoke about Morse code, with a precision that most of them found both impressive and slightly alarming. They called her Miss Calloway, not giant woman, not that tall one, Miss Calloway. She was 23 years old. She had more than enough room. In the spring, she received a letter from Greystone, from Harriet Colm, the banker's wife, the woman who had looked at her across a post office counter on Aid Dear, on day 18, and said, "You look tired, dear," and walked away, the letter said. Miss Calloway, I don't know if you will read this. I don't know if I deserve to have it read. I am writing it anyway, because the alternative is to continue being a woman who looked away, and I have spent enough of my life being her. What we did to you, what we let happen, was wrong. Not only what Wade Harlan did, what the rest of us did. Every morning of those 3 weeks when we saw you standing there and chose to be somewhere else inside ourselves. I can't undo it, I know that. I am not writing to ask you to tell me it's all right. I am writing because I think you deserve to hear. I see it now. I see what it was, and I am sorry. Vera read it twice. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about what sorry meant and what it didn't mean. She thought about Pruitt's letter and the careful distinction she had maintained between understanding a person's choices and absolving them. She thought about the fact that Harriet Colm had sat down and written this letter knowing it might not be answered, knowing it might not be welcomed, knowing it cost something to send it, and she had sent it anyway. She wrote back, not with forgiveness in the large, sweeping sense, not with words that would release Harriet Colm from the weight-gushki. That wasn't Vera's to give, and she had learned to be honest about what was and wasn't hers to give. She wrote with something more specific. Mrs. Colm, I received your letter. I am glad you wrote it. Not for my sake, exactly. But because writing is different from not writing it, and you know that. You would not have written it, if you didn't know that. I don't need Greystone to feel differently about what happened. What I needed was one person willing to stop. I found one. It was enough. I hope your town finds its way to being the kind of place where stopping is ordinary, where it doesn't require a stranger passing through to make it possible. That kind of town is worth living in, worth building. I am well. I sit without pain. A man comes down from the mountain on Tuesdays. That is more than enough. It is, in fact, considerably more than enough. With regards, Vera Calloway. She sealed the envelope, filed the carbon copy under C, where she filed everything. Outside the window of the Millhaven post office, the peaks of the Wind River Range sat where they always sat, patient, enormous, scaled to something larger than any single life, which was not a diminishment. It was the point, 14 miles, on Tuesdays. A man came down from those mountains. She went back to work.